You ever wake up, pour yourself a cup of coffee, step out onto your deck, and suddenly realize somebody with a lot more money than you has decided your property is basically public access? Yeah, that was my entire summer. And the crazy part is, it didn't begin with yelling or threats or some dramatic confrontation. It started quietly, almost politely in a strange way, like the kind of disrespect that hides behind confidence and acts like it's perfectly normal. I live on a freshwater lake in what used to be one of those sleepy little towns where everybody knew everybody. Back then it was mostly retirees, fishermen, old cabins. Now it's all giant glass houses and people saying things like we only stay here for the season, as if the rest of us aren't living here all year long. My place is simple. One story, gravel walkway leading down to the shore, and a wooden dock I built myself back in 2020. Pulled every permit, passed every inspection, followed every rule because I learned years ago that if you cut corners, eventually somebody uses it against you. The dock itself isn't anything fancy either. Pressure-treated wood, steel cleats, weathered gray boards that soak up the sun and smell like lake water mixed with sunscreen. By the middle of June, my little aluminum fishing boat sits on one side, while the other side stays empty. Always did. I liked having the extra space. Somewhere quiet to sit with my legs hanging over the edge watching the water move. Apparently, though, to certain kinds of people, empty doesn't mean private. It means available. The first time it happened was late June on a Friday afternoon. Hot enough outside that the air felt thick. I glanced toward the water and saw this polished fiberglass bowrider tied neatly to my cleat. Blue canvas top, shining like it had never spent a single day in rough weather. No note, no knock on the door, no hey neighbor mind if we dock here for a while. Just sitting there like it belonged. I remember standing there for a moment wondering if I somehow missed some announcement. Maybe there was a new lake policy or HOA agreement I'd never heard about. But there wasn't. My property line extends straight out from the dock, clearly marked on the survey. There was no confusion here, just entitlement. So I walked down calmly, untied the rope, and gave the boat a light push away from the pier. Nothing violent, nothing reckless, just enough for it to drift until the anchor grabbed hold. Didn't scratch it, didn't make a scene. I figured whoever owned it would understand the message. Next morning, same exact boat, same exact spot, except now the rope was tied tighter than before. That's when I realized this wasn't some innocent misunderstanding anymore. It was somebody testing boundaries. A few weeks later, another boat showed up. Different one this time, center console setup, but same behavior. No asking permission, no conversation, just treating my dock like part of their summer routine. I untied that one too, same calm approach. I still wasn't trying to escalate things. Not yet. Then one Tuesday morning, right in the middle of the week with nobody else around, I stepped outside holding my coffee and saw 3 separate boats tied to my dock at the same time. 3 boats worth more money than my entire house, just sitting there like I didn't exist. And all I could think was, do these people not see me? Or do they simply not care? Because honestly, that's the part that really gets under your skin. It's not even the boats. It's the attitude behind them. That quiet assumption that if you've got enough money, enough status, enough confidence, then other people's boundaries stop matching. By the middle of July, my dock barely even felt like mine anymore. It had basically turned into an unofficial marina for strangers who had never once introduced themselves to me. They'd pull up, tie off, leave for hours. Some nights, I'd hear music and laughter floating across the water while glasses clinked in the dark, all happening on something I built with my own hands and paid for myself. So I started paying closer attention. Real attention. I took photos of registration numbers, hull markings, dock permits, anything that could identify ownership. I never yelled at anybody or confronted them from shore. I just watched, documented, and waited. Eventually, I traced 2 of the boats back to a private waterfront club about a quarter mile up the shoreline. Big gated place with valet docking and expensive memberships, the kind of club where people don't even carry their own coolers. So I sent them a letter. Professional, calm, factual. Certified mail with signature confirmation. I explained clearly that my dock was private property and that their members had repeatedly been using it without permission. I asked them to handle it. A few days later, I got a response back. Short, polished, corporate sounding. Members may temporarily tie off in the area. No harm intended. No harm intended. That sentence stayed in my head for days. Not because it was inaccurate, but because it completely ignored the actual issue. Or maybe it didn't ignore it at all. Maybe they understood exactly what they were doing the entire time. Saying, "no harm intended," is usually what people say when they've spent their whole lives never being challenged. When their version of reality gets accepted automatically, because nobody around them wants conflict badly enough to push back. And standing there with that letter in my hand, I realized something important. None of this was going to stop by itself. And if I kept smiling, staying polite, and pretending it wasn't a big deal, all I was really doing was teaching them that using my property came without consequences. So instead of reacting emotionally, I folded the letter carefully, filed it away, and started thinking strategically. Because after years of living around people with deep pockets and even deeper entitlement, I'd learned one thing for sure. You don't defeat entitled people by arguing with them. You defeat them by making their behavior cost more than they expected. Now, before I continue, let me explain something because this is exactly where most people make mistakes. They respond emotionally without understanding the system they're actually fighting against. Waterfront property isn't only about ownership. It's about enforceable rights. And those are not the same thing. A dock can physically sit on your land, but if the permits, local registrations, or HOA regulations aren't airtight, enforcement suddenly becomes vague. And people who love bending rules thrive inside vague situations. Legally speaking, what those boat owners were doing falls into a frustrating gray category that happens more often than most people realize. Temporary use without direct refusal. Not technically theft, more like boundary testing, waiting to see whether anyone objects strongly enough to stop it. And when nobody pushes back, that behavior becomes normal almost overnight. And this is where things get really interesting because it turns into a psychological pattern. People with money, influence, and social backing often operate on assumed permission instead of actual permission. They're usually not thinking, "I'm doing something wrong." They're thinking, "Nobody has stopped me yet, so this must be acceptable." That's how small violations slowly evolve into habits, and habits eventually harden into entitlement. The real lesson is simple. If you don't define your boundaries clearly and enforce them consistently, somebody else will eventually redefine those boundaries for you, and almost always in a way that benefits them instead. So once I stopped viewing the situation as a personal irritation and started seeing it for what it really was, a system built around testing limits and exploiting silence, everything about the way I handled it began to change. The problem was, I finally stopped handling things the quiet way. No more slipping down to the dock at sunrise to untie strangers' boats. No more standing there hoping people might suddenly grow some respect if I stayed patient long enough. People who never struggle for anything don't notice hints. They ignore them because they've never had consequences attached before. So Monday morning, I made a phone call to the county waterways office. Nothing aggressive, nothing emotional, just a calm conversation with the right department. I asked a few simple questions and acted a little unsure, because sometimes people explain more when they think you don't already know the answer. And that's when I found out about it. A licensed mooring slip application. 1 page of paperwork, 1 inspection, a yearly fee that barely mattered. But the important part wasn't the license itself. It was what the license allowed you to do. It gave legal authority to assign docking space, charge usage fees, issue violations, and most importantly, request actual enforcement instead of filing complaints nobody ever follows up on. I filed the paperwork that Thursday without thinking twice. The inspector came the next Tuesday, older guy with a sunburnt neck and the kind of clipboard attitude that says he's seen everything already. He walked the entire pier slowly, checked every bolt and cleat, asked a few basic questions while scribbling notes. "You build this yourself?" he asked. I told him yeah. He nodded once like he respected the effort and signed off without dragging the process out. 8 days later, I had the laminated sign sitting in my hands, weatherproof with an official county seal stamped across the bottom. I didn't rush to hang it either. I took my time drilling it into the main post right at eye level, stepping back every few seconds to make sure it sat perfectly straight. Licensed commercial slip. Unauthorized mooring subject to towing and impoundment. Fee schedule on file. Simple wording, clean and emotionless, just rules written in black and white. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. That same blue bayliner that started this whole mess drifted back the following Saturday like it owned the place, tying up in the exact same spot with the same neat knots and the same quiet arrogance. But this time the situation had changed completely. I didn't walk down to the dock. I didn't touch the ropes or leave notes or say a single word. I just made one phone call. Marine Patrol answered quicker than I expected. Maybe they were having a slow day. Maybe they already knew about the club. Didn't matter. I gave them the location, the registration number, and mentioned the slip's license status. That alone was enough. About an hour later, I heard the low engine cutting across the water before I saw the patrol boat easing toward the dock without any rush at all. Two officers climbed out calm and professional, tying alongside the bayliner like they were docking beside a friend's boat. They checked the registration numbers, snapped photos, wrote a few things down, and then simply waited. Nobody came. By noon, they were still sitting there while the sun climbed higher overhead, and the water reflected that harsh, bright glare that makes every detail look sharper than normal. Around 2 in the afternoon, the tow crew finally arrived, backing a flatbed trailer down the public launch nearby with the smooth coordination of people who had definitely done this before. They slid straps under the hull, lifted the boat clean out of the water, drained it, secured everything down, and disappeared in less than 20 minutes. The whole time I stayed on my deck holding a cup of coffee in my hand again. Only this time it never got cold. I wasn't angry anymore. Wasn't smug either. I was simply watching the system work exactly the way it was supposed to. 12 miles away, that boat ended up sitting in an impound lot with retrieval fees somewhere over $300. For somebody who owns a boat like that, it probably wasn't financially devastating. But the amount never mattered. The real point was inconvenience, friction, consequences. The very next weekend, another boat showed up, the center console this time. Maybe they never heard about the first impound. Maybe they assumed it wouldn't apply to them. Maybe they thought the first tow had been some weird accident. Same process, same outcome. Gone. And that's when the atmosphere around everything started shifting. Not dramatically or all at once, but enough that you could feel it in the air. Monday morning, my phone rang from an unknown number. I answered and immediately recognized the controlled voice on the other end. Hi, this is Daniel from Ridgeway Shore Club. We received notice regarding 2 vessels recently impounded. There it was. Same guy who sent the original letter, same polished tone, except now there was pressure underneath it, maybe even irritation. I didn't interrupt him once. Just listened quietly while he kept talking. We'd like to resolve this situation amicably. Of course they would. So I answered calmly, keeping my voice completely even. There's nothing to resolve. The dock is licensed now. The terms are posted. Then silence settled onto the line. You could almost hear the shift in his voice, like someone mentally rearranging numbers the second they realized the situation wasn't going the way they expected. The tone changed from dismissive to practical almost instantly. What kind of terms would that involve for the members? That right there was the turning point. The second someone stops demanding and starts asking, the entire balance changes. So I kept it straightforward. No dramatic numbers, no emotional pitch. Just the actual value for dock space around that marina. 2 slips at $175 a month each. Renewable agreement. 30-day written notice if either side wanted out. Basic, standard terms. Another silence followed, but this one was shorter. That sounds fair. Yeah, because it was. We finished the conversation quickly after that. No casual conversation afterward. No apology either, though honestly I never expected one. People like that rarely apologize. They simply adapt when circumstances force them to. By the end of the week, the paperwork was finalized and the agreement officially signed. Just like that, the same dock everyone treated like public parking suddenly became a legitimate income-producing asset. Every single month, those 2 slips now pay my property taxes entirely, not part of them, all of them. And the strange thing is almost nothing else changed. My fishing boat still rests on the same side of the dock. Same faded paint. Same stubborn motor that coughs before starting, same calm mornings out on the water. But now when I stand there looking across the marina, I don't see entitlement anymore. I see order. Because once the proper structure exists, people don't magically become more respectful. They simply start acting differently within the rules that are finally enforced. And honestly, that's usually enough. Now this is normally the point where people expect some dramatic ending. Like I beat a bunch of wealthy boat owners at their own game and walked away victorious. But truthfully, that's never what this was about. It wasn't really about winning at all. It was about finally understanding how these situations actually work and realizing how many people misunderstand the rules without even noticing it. Because if you really think about it, the issue didn't begin the day those boats appeared at my dock. It started long before that. It started the moment I convinced myself that owning something automatically meant controlling what happened around it. That simply because something belongs to you, everyone else will naturally respect that boundary. It sounds reasonable in theory, but real life doesn't operate that way. The real lesson is that boundaries don't exist just because you quietly believe they should. They only exist when you define them clearly and reinforce them consistently. And sure, that sounds simple when someone says it out loud, but most people avoid one important part of it. Usually the enforcement side, because enforcement feels uncomfortable. It feels confrontational. It makes you feel like the difficult person in the situation. But the reality is if you refuse to protect your boundaries, someone else will eventually test them. And if there's no resistance, people naturally continue pushing further into that space without even thinking about it. Not always because they're malicious. Sometimes it's habit. Sometimes convenience. And sometimes, honestly, it's because they believe nobody will stop them. Entitlement doesn't appear overnight. And that's where the deeper psychological side of all this starts to matter. What I was dealing with wasn't just random bad behavior from one difficult person. It was a repeating cycle, a mindset built around assumed permission. People stop asking themselves, is this actually allowed? And instead start asking, will anyone really stop me? Those are completely different ways of thinking. And once someone crosses a boundary enough times without consequences, their mind slowly rewrites the rules. The line that used to exist fades away. In their eyes, they're no longer doing something wrong. They're simply continuing a behavior that has always worked for them. So when someone finally challenges it, they feel attacked, like you're suddenly changing the agreement, even though all you're really doing is reclaiming what belonged to you in the first place. And the moment you respond emotionally, shouting, arguing, or making it personal, your position actually becomes weaker because now it looks like a clash between two angry people instead of a clear violation of boundaries and structure. That's the reason the shift in approach matters so much. The second I stopped framing it as my dock versus your boat and started treating it as licensed space versus unauthorized use, the entire situation changed. Legally speaking, structure wins over emotion almost every time. You don't have to be louder than the other person. You just have to be more precise. You don't have to fight harder. You have to make the rules impossible to ignore. Once those rules become visible, documented, and enforceable, people adapt surprisingly fast. Not because they suddenly gain respect for you, but because ignoring you becomes more expensive and inconvenient than simply following the rules. And honestly, that's the real core of the whole thing. You don't solve entitlement by trying to fix someone's personality or mindset. You solve it by changing the environment they operate in. Make the bad behavior inconvenient, costly, or impossible to continue, and watch how quickly it disappears. Now, does that mean every small disagreement needs to turn into a legal battle? Of course not. There's a huge difference between someone making a one-time mistake and someone repeatedly crossing the same boundary over and over again. There's a difference between somebody who genuinely didn't know and somebody who simply didn't care. But when you start seeing repetition, when the same issue keeps happening again and again, that's your sign. That's the moment it stops being accidental. That's when it becomes a system. And systems don't respond to emotions. They respond to structure. So if you ever find yourself dealing with something like this, whether it's a dock, a parking spot, a shared fence, HOA drama, or anything similar, pause for a second before reacting emotionally and ask yourself one question. Am I dealing with a person or a pattern? Because if it's only a person, maybe a calm conversation is enough to solve it. But if it's a pattern, then words alone usually aren't strong enough. That's when you need a framework. That's when you need leverage. And yes, sometimes that means paperwork, permits, policies, and all the boring things people hate dealing with until the day they actually need them. But those are the very things that protect you when it truly matters. In my situation, it didn't just fix the problem. It unexpectedly turned into something useful, and honestly, that was probably the last thing anyone expected. I never went into this thinking I'd somehow end up creating extra income from it. I only wanted my space back. But once the structure was finally in place, opportunities started showing up naturally. And that's another lesson people often miss. Sometimes the thing causing you the most frustration isn't only a problem. Sometimes it's an asset you haven't organized properly yet. So yeah, that's basically the story. And now I'm genuinely curious what you would have done that very first morning if you walked outside holding your coffee and saw a stranger's boat tied to something you built with your own money on property that was supposed to be yours. Would you have shoved it away like I did, ignored it completely, confronted the owner directly, or gone straight to enforcement? Drop your answer in the comments. I read way more of those replies than I probably should.